In the 1600s, the area that we now know as Massachusetts underwent a series of dramatic changes following the arrival of the Puritans who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In this video, we'll learn who the Puritans were and why they settled in Massachusetts. We'll examine what impact Puritan colonization had on Indigenous peoples, and discover how the arrival of the first enslaved West Africans would change Massachusetts. The Puritans were English Protestants who centered their way of life around their Christian faith. Like the Pilgrims, they believed that the Church of England had strayed too far from the essential teachings of the Bible and wanted to reform it from within. This put them at odds with King Charles I, head of the Church of England, who viewed nonconformists as a threat to his authority. Under his reign, the Puritans were oppressed. Some were even branded or imprisoned for their religious views. Inspired by the example of the Pilgrims, who established England's first permanent settlement in Massachusetts, the Puritans formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. Believing a new colony would benefit both England and the Puritans, the king granted them a royal charter to establish another colony. Between 1630 and 1640, around 20,000 Puritans sailed across the Atlantic. Under the leadership of lawyer John Winthrop, they built a settlement on a hill that would eventually be named Boston. The Puritans founded their own churches and established farms, fisheries, lumber yards, ironworks, and other businesses. The Massachusetts Bay Colony began to expand, but at significant cost to the indigenous peoples who already lived in the region. Since time immemorial, many indigenous nations have lived across present-day Massachusetts. Each has developed distinct cultural heritages. The Nauset have lived in the Cape Cod area. The Wampanoag have lived in the southeast of Massachusetts. And the Massachusetts people have lived around the eastern coastal region, including where Boston is today. The Nipmuc have lived in central Massachusetts, as well as parts of Connecticut and Rhode Island. The Pennacook have lived to the north in the Merrimack River Valley, and the Pecumtuck have lived in western Massachusetts. Indigenous peoples had faced significant challenges since the arrival of European explorers, including the spread of diseases such as smallpox. The Great Dying killed an estimated 90% of the population in some areas of New England. By the time the Puritans arrived and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the land that had previously been occupied appeared abandoned. In 1634, John Winthrop wrote, "For the natives, they are near all dead of the smallpox, so the Lord hath cleared our title to what we possess." To the Puritans, this seemingly empty land aligned with their belief that it was their God-given right to claim it and it was something to be owned. In contrast to the settlers, indigenous peoples viewed themselves as stewards of the land rather than its owners, and had a symbiotic relationship with nature and the environment. The arrival of the Europeans was to have a devastating impact on the way land was used, which would change it forever. Desperate to protect their lands and preserve their lifeways, many indigenous peoples resisted colonial expansion. In 1636, the Pequot rose up against settlers but were overpowered. As the Puritans stepped up the expansion of their settlements across Massachusetts, tensions rose between them and the indigenous peoples. These strains led to what is referred to by some as King Philip's War, which devastated the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and many other indigenous communities. The war facilitated further colonial expansion in southern New England, and many indigenous peoples were sold into slavery or forced to relocate. Just as the colonization of Massachusetts had a profoundly negative impact on indigenous peoples, the growth of the Massachusetts Bay Colony would enable another historic injustice in the history of the United States: the enslavement of West Africans. In 1638, a ship known as the Desire returned to Massachusetts from the West Indies. John Winthrop documented its cargo, which included some cotton and tobacco and Negroes. The enslaved Africans on board had been exchanged for Pequot prisoners taken during the Pequot War, a violent conflict between the Pequot and English settlers and their allies, sparked by competition over land and trade. Historians suggest that the exchange of Pequot prisoners was part of a colonial strategy to remove indigenous resistance from the colonies. The ship's arrival is the first documented evidence of African slavery in Massachusetts. At first, enslaved Africans were treated the same way as indentured servants. Initially, most indentured servants were European immigrants, primarily young men looking for opportunities, working to pay back the cost of their voyage. After up to 7 years of unpaid labor, they were usually set free. But when the number of immigrants decreased and the availability of labor decreased, Massachusetts became the first colony to legalize slavery. While many European indentured servants were able to buy their freedom, many West Africans were not given the same opportunity. In 1754, a census showed that the majority of enslaved people in Massachusetts were males who had been captured in West Africa. These enslaved men were forced to work on the Boston docks or were skilled workers like carpenters or blacksmiths, while enslaved women were forced to work in homes and care for their enslavers' children. Boston quickly became an important center for the highly lucrative slave trade. Gradually, some enslaved people gained their freedom or were emancipated. Enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley was granted her freedom soon after her first book was published. Revolutionary leader Prince Hall was liberated after the Boston Massacre, and he became an important figure in the abolitionist movement. Other African American people in Massachusetts were born free, like Paul Cuffey, a man of African and Wampanoag descent who was a successful ship owner and abolitionist. Towards the end of the 1700s, the abolitionist movement grew stronger. And when in 1780, the Massachusetts Constitution declared all men are born free and equal, Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker, both enslaved, each sued the state for their freedom. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled that perpetual servitude was inconsistent with the Massachusetts Constitution, effectively abolishing slavery in the state some 80 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. The Puritan colonization of Massachusetts can be seen as instrumental in shaping the political and cultural foundations of what would become the United States, embedding values such as self-governance, hard work, community, religious belief, and education. But the colony thrived by the aggressive displacement of indigenous peoples and the legalization of slavery. Conversely, Massachusetts emerged as an early leader in the abolitionist movement, highlighting the complex legacy of its foundational period.